The world held its breath. On the skull-shaped hill of Golgotha, a profound and terrible silence descended, broken only by the weeping of a heartbroken few and the indifferent chatter of Roman soldiers. The sky, once unnaturally dark as if in mourning, began to bleed back into the pale hues of late afternoon. To the eyes of man, the story was over. The self-proclaimed King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, was dead. His body, a brutalized canvas of human cruelty, hung limp and lifeless upon the cross. The great rebellion, the promised kingdom, had ended in the most final way imaginable, with a last, ragged breath. But what the world perceived as an ending was, in the unseen realm, a cataclysmic beginning. When Jesus cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," it was not a whisper of surrender. It was a roar of command, a key turning in a cosmic lock. In that precise moment, his spirit, an entity of pure, uncreated light and absolute authority, was not extinguished, but unleashed. It was a deliberate act, a strategic maneuver foretold in eternity. As he had declared, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." This was not the passive submission of a victim, it was the first move in the final battle, a willing descent into the very heart of the enemy's territory. Instantly, the universe convulsed. In the heart of Jerusalem, within the hallowed temple, the great veil, a curtain so thick and heavy that it was said to require multiple men to move it, was torn in two. It did not fray or rip from a corner. Eyewitness accounts from terrified priests would later speak of an invisible force that seized the fabric from top to bottom, rending it with a sound like tearing thunder. The barrier between a holy God and sinful humanity, meticulously maintained for centuries, was violently and irrevocably shattered. This was the first shot fired in a war that had been silent for millennia. Simultaneously, the very ground beneath Golgotha groaned in protest. The earth trembled, not with a gentle quake, but with violent, shuddering spasms. Ancient rocks, silent witnesses to ages of history, split apart with sharp cracks. And from the fissures, something even more profound occurred. Tombs, long sealed and forgotten, were broken open. An eerie light seemed to emanate from within, a prelude to a miracle that would only be fully understood 3 days later. The death of this one man provoked a reaction in creation itself, as if the physical world was screaming in protest at the departure of its creator. While these visible signs shocked the living, a far deeper drama was unfolding in the spiritual dimension. The Spirit of Christ, now fully separated from its earthly vessel, did not ascend into the celestial light of the Father's presence. Not yet. His mission required a detour. He began a journey downward, into what the scriptures call the lower parts of the earth, the heart of the earth. This was not merely the grave, the cold stone tomb where his body would soon be laid by loving hands. This was a descent into the spiritual realm of the dead, a place known to the Hebrews as Sheol and the Greeks as Hades. Sheol was a vast, silent kingdom of shades, a spiritual continent divided by an impassable chasm. On one side lay a place of comfort, a peaceful waiting area known as Abraham's bosom or paradise. Here the souls of the righteous, Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and all who had died in faith, clinging to a promise they had not yet seen, rested in a sacred limbo. They were waiting for the Redeemer, waiting for the fulfillment that would finally grant them access to heaven itself. On the other side of the great chasm lay a place of torment, of darkness and regret, where the unrighteous awaited final judgment. This was the domain that had held humanity captive since the fall. Its master, the ancient serpent, Satan, the accuser, believed his victory was complete. He had orchestrated the ultimate betrayal, manipulated the pinnacle of human justice into a mockery, and extinguished the light of the world. He watched, gloating, as the broken body was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen by the sorrowful Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and sealed in a tomb. To the Prince of Darkness, the stone rolled in front of the tomb was a final seal on his triumph. But he was mistaken. As the stone sealed the physical body in darkness, the radiant Spirit of Christ was descending, not as a captive soul, but as a conquering king. This was not a retreat. It was an invasion, a divine special operative breaching the front lines of the enemy. Every step downward into the spiraling depths of the spiritual underworld was a step of deliberate, sovereign power. The legions of darkness, accustomed to receiving trembling, frightened souls, recoiled from this presence. They felt not the cold fear of a new prisoner, but the searing heat of an authority they had not encountered since their own fall from heaven. He arrived at the very gates of Sheol. These were not gates of iron or brass, but barriers woven from eons of despair, fear, and divine judgment. They hummed with an ancient, dark energy, designed to be an eternal one-way door. No soul had ever passed through them and returned by its own power. But the being who now stood before them was not just a soul. He was the author of life itself. He stood in silence, a figure of pure, contained light against an infinite backdrop of shadow. And as he stood there, the very foundations of the underworld began to tremble, for the gates recognized their true master, and the silent, shadowy kingdom of the dead knew, with a dawning terror, that it was about to be conquered from within. The air in Sheol was thick with the weight of ages, a silent, breathless atmosphere of waiting. It was a realm devoid of time, as mortals knew it, a place where moments stretched into eternities of either placid hope or agonizing regret. As Jesus moved through the outer regions of this silent world, he was not a wandering shade, but a presence of such immense gravity that the very fabric of the spiritual reality bent around him. The shadows themselves seemed to flee from his path, and the whispers of tormented souls on the far side of the chasm fell silent, as if silenced by an authority they could not comprehend, but were forced to respect. His first destination was not paradise, where the righteous saints yearned for his arrival. Before the liberation, there had to be a proclamation. Before the rescue, there had to be a reckoning. He journeyed deeper, past the familiar realms of human dead, descending into a pit within the pit, an abyss so profound it was known only in terrified whispers and ancient forbidden texts. This was the prison mentioned by the Apostle Peter, a place of chains of gloomy darkness, reserved not for human souls, but for a specific class of spiritual rebels. These were not the common demons that roamed the earth, tempting and tormenting humanity. These were beings of a different order, angelic entities who had committed a crime so heinous, so disruptive to the cosmic order, that God had imprisoned them immediately, sealing them away until the final great day of judgment. The Apostle Jude spoke of them as the angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. They were the sons of God from the ancient world before the flood, those who, as Genesis records, looked upon the daughters of man, lusted after them, and crossed an unforgivable boundary. They had defiled God's creation, mingling the spiritual with the physical in an unholy union that produced the Nephilim, hybrid giants whose violence and corruption had filled the earth and provoked the cleansing waters of the great deluge. They had been imprisoned here for millennia, locked in a spiritual Tartarus, a place of absolute isolation. They had instigated a rebellion intended to corrupt the human bloodline and prevent the birth of the promised seed of the woman, the very Messiah who now stood before them. In their abyssal prison, they had been aware, in some dim, tortured way, of the unfolding drama on earth. They had felt the ripples when the Messiah was born in Bethlehem. They had sensed the power when he calmed the seas and cast out their lesser brethren. And they had felt a surge of dark, triumphant hope when they sensed his life force extinguished on the cross. They believed their ancient enemy had finally been defeated. Now, that defeated enemy stood in the heart of their prison. Light, pure and unyielding, pierced the gloom for the first time in history. Jesus did not arrive as a fellow prisoner. He came as a judge and a herald. The chains of darkness, which were not made of metal but of divine verdict, hummed and vibrated with terror at his approach. The ancient, arrogant spirits who had once held dominion now cowered in his presence. He did not speak words of comfort or offer a path to redemption. The time for mercy for them had long since passed. The Greek word the Apostle Peter would later use to describe this moment was kerusois. Did not mean to preach the gospel for salvation, but to make a formal, authoritative proclamation, like a herald announcing the victory of his king in the capital of a conquered enemy. And so he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the abyss, resonating in the very essence of the imprisoned beings. It was a voice of absolute, calm, and final authority. He proclaimed the triumph of the cross. He announced that the plan they had sought to sabotage from the dawn of time had been brought to its perfect, unstoppable consummation. He declared that his death was not a defeat, but the very mechanism of their ultimate undoing, the fulfillment of the ancient promise in Eden that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. He, a man born of a woman, had defeated sin and death, and his presence here, alive and sovereign in the heart of their prison, was the irrefutable evidence. He was the ultimate legal statement. Their ancient rebellion was a cosmic crime, and he was the verdict. They had bet everything on corrupting humanity, and now the perfect human, the Son of God, stood before them as their judge. The proclamation was a sentence. Their rebellion had failed, their power was broken, and their final judgment was now sealed and certain. The hope they had felt at his death was extinguished, replaced by the cold, eternal certainty of their defeat. They were forced to witness the very one they sought to destroy, now holding the keys to the kingdom they had lost forever. Having delivered this cosmic legal notice, Jesus turned from the abyss. The light receded, and the profound eternal gloom returned. But it was now a different kind of darkness. It was no longer the darkness of waiting, but the darkness of a confirmed and sealed doom. His work here was done. The legal declaration had been made to the highest spiritual criminals. Now, his path led him back up, across the great chasm, toward the other side of Sheol. He moved toward the gentle, expectant light of paradise, where the air was not filled with dread, but with centuries of patient, unwavering faith. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses the lawgiver, David the king, Isaiah the prophet, and countless faithful souls were waiting. They had seen this day from afar through the eyes of faith. Now they were about to see their Redeemer face to face. The Liberator was coming to sign their release order. As Jesus ascended from the abyssal depths, the oppressive atmosphere of judgment gave way to a palpable air of anticipation. He crossed the great, impassable chasm, a barrier that no soul had ever been able to traverse. Not by bridging it, but by simply walking across it, its laws of separation having no authority over the lawgiver himself. On the other side, a soft, peaceful light emanated from the realm known as paradise or Abraham's bosom. This was not the brilliant, all-consuming glory of heaven, but a gentle, comforting luminescence, like the first light of dawn after a long night. Here, in this tranquil waiting place, resided the righteous of all the ages. They were not prisoners in torment, but honored guests in a house of waiting. Here was Abel, the first martyr, whose righteous blood had cried out from the ground. Here was Noah, the shipbuilder of faith, who had obeyed God against all logic. Here was Abraham, the father of faith himself, who had left his home for a promise he would not see fulfilled in his lifetime. He sat, as if in a place of honor, and with him were Isaac and Jacob, the patriarchs of the covenant. Nearby was Moses, his face still holding a faint, residual echo of the glory he had seen on Sinai, his spirit now free from the burden of leading a rebellious people. He had seen the promised land from afar, but had not entered. Now he was about to enter the true promised land. Beside him stood King David, the shepherd king, the man after God's own heart, whose psalms had so often prophesied this very moment, speaking of a soul that would not be abandoned to Sheol, of a Holy One who would not see decay. And there was Isaiah, who had spoken with such clarity of the suffering servant, who had foreseen the virgin birth, the wounds, and the ultimate triumph. and Daniel, who had stood unbowed before kings and lions, and Ruth, whose faithfulness had woven her into the Messiah's own lineage. For centuries they had waited. Their faith had been their light in the darkness of the grave. They had died holding on to a divine promise, a future redemption they understood only in shadows and types. As the writer to the Hebrews would later explain, all these died in faith, without having received the things promised, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance. God had prepared something better, so that, apart from us, they would not be made perfect. They were waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. They were waiting for him. When Jesus entered paradise, a hush fell over the assembled multitude of saints. It was a silence not of fear, but of profound, overwhelming awe. They saw him, not as the world had last seen him, a broken, bleeding figure on a cross, but as a radiant being of light and power, yet still bearing the marks. The wounds in his hands, his feet, and his side were not grotesque scars of defeat. They shone with a soft, glorious light, eternal emblems of a love that had paid the ultimate price. They were the signatures on their pardon. Abraham rose, his ancient eyes filled with tears of fulfillment. This was the descendant through whom he was promised all nations of the earth would be blessed. David bowed his head, recognizing his Lord, the one he had written of in Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies your footstool." Isaiah gazed upon the very one whose suffering and glory he had so vividly foretold. All the prophecies, all the sacrifices, all the types and shadows of the law and the prophets culminated in this single, glorious person standing before them. Jesus looked upon them, and his gaze was filled with an infinite, tender love. These were the heroes of faith, the ones who had kept the flame of hope alive through dark and desperate centuries. He had come to tell them the waiting was over. His arrival mirrored the ancient story of Israel's liberation from Egypt, but on a cosmic scale. This was the ultimate exodus. Sheol was their Egypt, the land of bondage under the shadow of death. Jesus was their greater Moses, come not with a staff, but with his own authority. The blood of the Lamb shed on the cross was the true Passover blood that protected them from the final death. And now he had come to lead them out, not across a red sea of water, but through the very gates of death itself. He spoke, and his voice was like the sound of living water in a barren land. "The time has come," he declared. "The debt has been paid. The way is open. The Father's house awaits you." This announcement was the fulfillment of what the Apostle Paul would later describe with the words of the psalmist. When he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. The captives he led were not prisoners of war, but a rescued people, a host of liberated saints who had been held captive by the limitations of the Old Covenant and the reality of death. He was leading captivity captive, conquering the very power that held them. In that moment, a supernatural event rippled back into the physical world. In Jerusalem, as Matthew's Gospel records, something astonishing happened in conjunction with his resurrection. The tombs that had been broken open at his death now released their occupants. Many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. This was a visible sign, a physical testimony to the invisible, spiritual exodus that was taking place. A vanguard of the redeemed was given physical form to announce that the liberator had come and the great escape from death's domain was underway. In paradise, a procession formed. It was a triumphal parade unlike any other. Jesus, the conquering king, led the way. Behind him followed a vast multitude of the righteous, a river of souls flowing from the heart of the earth upwards towards the light. The great chasm that had separated them from heaven was now gone, erased by the power of his sacrifice. The journey that had been impossible was now their glorious reality. As they ascended, they passed by the tormented side of Sheol, a silent, final testament to the two destinies that had been sealed. For the righteous, it was a march of freedom. For the damned, it was a vision of the glory they had forfeited. The great exodus had begun, and the king was leading his people home. While the great spiritual exodus was commencing, a final, critical act of conquest had to be performed. Jesus, leading the liberated saints, paused. His mission in the underworld was not merely to proclaim judgment and rescue the faithful. It was to fundamentally and permanently alter the very structure of the spiritual cosmos. He had to seize the master controls of the enemy's kingdom. He had to take the keys. Since the fall of Adam, death had been more than a biological event. It had become a spiritual power, a principality. Satan, the ancient usurper, had been given a form of dominion over this realm. He was, as the Book of Hebrews describes, the one who held the power of death. He wielded this power not just to end physical life, but to hold humanity in bondage through fear. The fear of the unknown, the fear of judgment, the fear of annihilation. This was the chain with which he bound the souls of men. The entire empire of darkness was built on this one terrible foundation, the finality of the grave. The keys to this empire, the symbolic keys of death and of Hades, represented this authority. They were the power to lock the gates behind every soul that entered, to ensure that Sheol was a one-way destination. They represented the legal right, granted by humanity's own sin, to hold creation in a state of decay and separation from its creator. This realm of Sheol was, in a cosmological sense, a reflection of the primordial chaos described in the opening of Genesis. It was a place formless and void, a realm of darkness and deep, a spiritual wasteland where the life-giving breath of God did not actively dwell. Adam, who was meant to be God's regent, to fill the earth with life and order, had instead surrendered his authority, plunging his descendants into this shadowy echo of chaos. Now Jesus, the second Adam, the perfect man and true king, had come to reclaim what was lost and restore divine order to the cosmos. His descent into Sheol was a deliberate act of recreation. Just as the Spirit of God had once moved over the face of the waters to bring forth light and life, the Spirit of Christ now moved through the depths of the underworld to bring forth a new creation. He confronted the very source of this dark authority. It was not a physical confrontation with a horned beast, but a spiritual transfer of power based on an unassailable legal and moral victory. Satan, the prince of this realm, stood before Christ, but his power was gone. The accuser had no accusation to make. He had thrown everything he had at this man: temptation, betrayal, torture, and death, and none of it had worked. Jesus had lived a sinless life, and therefore death had no legal claim on him. By killing the one person over whom it had no right, the system of death had overplayed its hand and destroyed itself. The trap set for Christ had sprung on its master. In a moment that shook the foundations of both the seen and unseen worlds, Jesus simply took the keys. The Apostle John would later see this moment in a vision on Patmos and hear the triumphant declaration from the risen Lord, "I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades." The transfer of authority was absolute. The power to lock the gates was now replaced by the power to unlock them. The reign of fear was broken, replaced by the promise of life. The dominion that Adam had forfeited was now reclaimed by the Son of Man. This was not just a victory for humanity, it was a victory for all of creation. As the Apostle Paul wrote, "Creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption." This moment, this seizure of the keys, was the turning point in that liberation. As he held the keys, they did not feel like cold metal in his spiritual hands. They pulsed with a new purpose. They were no longer instruments of imprisonment, but tools of freedom. With them, he would unlock the grave for all who would put their trust in him. He would transform the enemy's fortress into a passageway to the Father's house. This act completed the cosmological restoration. The chaos of Sheol had been confronted by the ultimate order. The darkness had been invaded by the source of all light. The power of decay had been broken by the power of eternal life. The universe was being recalibrated to its original design, centered not on sin and death, but on righteousness and resurrection. With the keys now firmly in his possession and the triumphant procession of saints following in his wake, Jesus turned his attention upward. The first phase of his post-mortem mission was complete. He had judged the fallen, liberated the faithful, and conquered the very principality of death. But before he would return to his physical body in the tomb, there was one more journey to make. He had to ascend, not yet to earth, but to the heavenly sanctuary, to the very throne room of the cosmos. He had to present the evidence of his victory and the price of his sacrifice directly to the Father. The high priest had completed the offering on the earthly altar of the cross. Now, he had to enter the true Holy of Holies. The story of a hero descending into the underworld to confront death and rescue a captive is one of the oldest and most powerful narratives known to humanity. It resonates in the deepest part of the human psyche, a mythic echo of a universal longing for a champion who can conquer our ultimate foe. The Greeks told of Orpheus, the divine musician who charmed his way into Hades with his lyre to retrieve his beloved Eurydice, only to fail at the final moment by looking back. Mesopotamian legends spoke of Inanna's descent into the netherworld, from which she returned, but only by providing a substitute. The Norse sagas recounted Odin hanging himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights, a journey through death to gain the wisdom of the runes. These stories, powerful as they were all tinged with tragedy, limitation, and failure. They were heroic attempts, but they were not ultimate victories. They were shadows, faint cultural premonitions of the true event that was now unfolding. Jesus of Nazareth was the true hero, the divine protagonist of the one story to which all others pointed. And unlike the heroes of myth, his journey into the abyss would not end in failure or compromise. It would end in absolute, unqualified triumph. Having conquered Sheol from within, he now began an ascent. But this was not yet the ascension that his disciples would witness 40 days later from the Mount of Olives. This was a spiritual ascension, an invisible journey from the depths of the earth into the highest heavens, into the very throne room of God the Father. He was accompanied by the glorious procession of the liberated saints, a cloud of witnesses to his victory, a testament to the efficacy of his sacrifice. As this triumphant parade approached the gates of the celestial city, a celestial challenge, ancient and liturgical, echoed through the heavens, just as King David had prophesied in Psalm 24. "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." From within the ramparts of heaven, a celestial query responded, a voice like the sounding of 1,000 trumpets. "Who is this King of glory?" And the angelic host accompanying the procession roared back the answer, "The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." The gates of heaven, which had never been closed to the Son in his divinity, now opened in a new way. They opened to receive him as the triumphant man, the representative of a redeemed humanity. He entered not just as the eternal Son, but as the conquering hero king, the captain of salvation, leading his rescued people home. He moved through the celestial courts, past ranks of seraphim and cherubim, who veiled their faces before his glory, a glory now uniquely magnified by the humility of his suffering. He approached the center of all reality, the throne of God the Father, a throne of blazing light and unbearable holiness. According to the Old Covenant, the earthly high priest would enter the Holy of Holies in the temple once a year, on the Day of Atonement. He would enter with fear and trembling, carrying the blood of a bull and a goat, to sprinkle it on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, making atonement for the sins of the people. This was a shadow, a ritualistic rehearsal for this very moment. Jesus, the great high priest, now entered the true sanctuary, the heavenly Holy of Holies. He did not come with the blood of animals, which could never truly take away sin. As the writer to the Hebrews describes, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. He stood before the Father. The eternal gaze of the Father met the gaze of the incarnate Son. In his spiritual form, Jesus presented the finished work. He presented his own blood, not as a sign of death, but as the price of eternal life. He presented the shining marks of his wounds, not as tokens of defeat, but as the jewels of his victory, the proof that the justice of God had been fully satisfied and the love of God had been fully expressed. In that holy, silent moment, a transaction of infinite significance was completed. The Father accepted the sacrifice. The atonement was declared perfect, complete, and eternal. The new covenant, written not on stone tablets but on the heart, was ratified in the blood of the Son. The access to God that had been blocked by the flaming sword east of Eden and veiled in the temple was now thrown wide open, forever. The hero had not just rescued the captives, he had reconciled the universe. He had bridged the chasm between God and man. Unlike Orpheus, he had not looked back. He had brought his redeemed all the way home. Unlike Odin, he had not just gained wisdom, he had become wisdom for all who would believe. He had succeeded where every mythical hero and every human being had failed. His mission in the heavens was complete. The legal and spiritual work of redemption was done. The victory was won, the price was paid, and the sacrifice was accepted. All that remained was for the world to see the proof. The hero king, his heavenly task accomplished, now turned his attention back toward the small, sealed tomb in a garden near Jerusalem. It was the third day. The earth was waiting for its king to return, not just in spirit, but in the flesh. The final act of the drama was about to begin. While a drama of cosmic proportions unfolded in the unseen realms, in the depths of Sheol and the heights of heaven, on earth, the world remained cloaked in the heavy pall of human sorrow and fear. The third day dawned, a Sunday, cool and quiet in the pre-dawn light of Jerusalem. For the followers of Jesus, it was a day of profound and hollow emptiness. Their hope, once so bright it had felt like the sun in their chests, had been brutally extinguished. It lay buried with their master in a borrowed tomb. The disciples were scattered, hidden behind locked doors, not for Sabbath observance, but for fear. The same authorities who had crucified Jesus could easily come for them next. Peter, the rock, had crumbled, his bold declarations now a source of burning shame after his threefold denial. He sat in a darkened room, the crowing of a rooster echoing in his soul, a sound more deafening than any silence. John, the beloved, was now the caregiver to a grieving mother, Mary, his heart torn between his duty to her and his own crushing sense of loss. They were a flock without a shepherd, and the wolves were circling. Their fear was more than just a fear of persecution. It was the primal, existential fear that Jesus himself had descended into the underworld to conquer, the fear of death. They had seen its power firsthand. They had seen it mock their hopes, silence their teacher, and scatter their movement. Death had appeared to be the ultimate reality, the final, unanswerable victor. It was, as the Apostle Paul would later call it, the last enemy, and to the disciples huddled in that upper room, it seemed utterly invincible. This fear is the bedrock of the human condition. It is the shadow that lurks behind every ambition, every love, every joy. It whispers that all things end, that all efforts are ultimately futile, that the grave is the final destination. It is this fear that Satan had wielded as his primary weapon, enslaving humanity not with physical chains, but with the psychological terror of non-existence. But as the first slivers of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the foundation of that fear was being systematically dismantled. The spiritual victory Jesus had won was about to manifest in the physical world. His journey through Sheol was not just a theological necessity, it was a profound act of divine empathy. By walking through the deepest darkness, he had sanctified every dark valley his followers would ever have to face. As the psalmist had unknowingly prophesied for this moment, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." He had gone first. He had charted the territory. He had proven that the shadow had no substance when confronted by the light. In the garden tomb, guarded by a detachment of elite Roman soldiers, The air began to change. The stone, a massive disc of rock weighing well over a ton, had been sealed with a Roman insignia. To break it was to defy the full might of the empire and invite a death sentence. The guards, confident in their strength and the finality of their task, stood their watch. Suddenly, the ground began to shake again, not with the agonized groans of Friday, but with a tremor of triumphant power. An angel of the Lord, his appearance like a flash of lightning and his clothes as white as snow, descended from heaven. The guards, hardened soldiers, trained to face down armed rebellion, fell to the ground like dead men, paralyzed by a terror that transcended the physical. They were not witnessing a human event. They were witnessing a divine one. The angel did not strain or struggle. He simply approached the tomb and, with an effortless gesture, rolled the massive stone away, not to let Jesus out, but to let the world in, to let them see that the victory had already been won. At that moment, inside the cold, dark tomb, the spirit of Jesus, returning from his cosmic journey, reunited with his physical body. The body, which had been pierced, scourged, and drained of life, was instantly quickened. Life, eternal and uncreated, surged through every cell. The mortal flesh was transfigured, transformed into a glorified, resurrected body. A body that was both physical enough to be touched and eat, yet spiritual enough to pass through locked doors. The shroud and the face cloth, which had been wrapped around him, collapsed in on themselves, left behind like the empty chrysalis of a butterfly that has taken flight. He sat up, he stood, he was alive. This was the moment that broke the back of fear. It was the irrefutable, physical proof that death was not the end. It was the dawn that banished the darkest night of the soul. The power that had conquered the spiritual realm of Hades had now conquered the physical reality of the grave. Unaware of this earth-shattering event, a small group of women, led by Mary Magdalene, were making their way to the tomb. Their hearts were heavy, their minds consumed by grief. They carried spices, a final act of love and devotion to anoint the body of their Lord. Their only concern was a practical one. Who will roll the stone away for us from the entrance of the tomb? They were still thinking within the confines of death's reality. They were about to have their reality, and the reality of the entire world, turned upside down. They were about to become the first witnesses to the fact that the greatest fear of humanity had been met and defeated by the greatest love in the universe. The hero had not only conquered the underworld, he had returned to show his people that there was nothing left to fear. The women arrived at the garden tomb as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed grass. The scene that greeted them was one of baffling chaos. The Roman guard, the symbol of imperial power, was gone, fled in terror to report an unbelievable story. The massive stone, the symbol of death's finality, was rolled away, revealing a dark, gaping entrance. Their hearts pounded with a mixture of confusion and fear. Had someone stolen the body? Mary Magdalene, overcome by a fresh wave of grief, ran back to tell Peter and John. The other women, peering into the tomb's entrance, saw not a body, but two angels in dazzling white, sitting where Jesus had lain. "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" one of them asked, his voice a gentle rebuke that reoriented their entire world view. "He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." The words struck them like lightning, just as he said. Suddenly, the cryptic prophecies, the strange parables, the promises that had seemed so incomprehensible before, began to ignite in their minds. The story of Jonah in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus had called it the only sign he would give. The prophecy that the temple of his body would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. It wasn't madness. It was a divine itinerary. The entire Old Testament, they began to realize, was not just a collection of laws and histories, it was a map. And every road, every signpost pointed to this very moment, this empty tomb. The 3 days were not a period of absence, but the fulfillment of every shadow. Peter and John, spurred by Mary's frantic report, ran to the tomb. John, being younger, outran Peter but paused at the entrance, peering in. He saw the linen cloths lying there, a detail of profound significance. Grave robbers would have taken the valuable linens or left them in a heap, but they were lying there, collapsed, an empty shell. Then Peter arrived and went straight in. He saw the burial cloths and the separate face cloth, neatly folded by itself. This was not the work of thieves. It was the work of someone who had left with unhurried, deliberate order. It was the calling card of the Lord of creation. And then John entered, and the scripture says simply, he saw and believed. The empty tomb was the public announcement, but the true evidence of victory would be the victor himself. Later that day, Jesus appeared to his disciples, huddled in their locked room of fear. He did not enter by the door. He simply stood among them, his presence filling the room with a peace that defied their terror. His first words were not of rebuke for their doubt and desertion, but of grace. Peace be with you. To prove he was not a ghost or a spirit, he showed them his hands and his side. He showed them his scars. This is perhaps the most profound detail of the resurrection. In his glorified, perfected body, he chose to retain the wounds. They were not ugly marks of torture anymore. They had been transformed into radiant emblems of victory, the everlasting symbols of his love. They were the scars that told the entire story. The story of a God who loved the world so much that he willingly entered its brokenness, descended into its deepest darkness, and bore its pain in his own body to bring it back to life. The keys of death and Hades that he had seized in the abyss were a symbol of his authority. The empty tomb was a symbol of his power, but the scars were the symbol of his love. They were the eternal answer to the question, "How much do you love me?" The answer was written in his hands and his side. In that moment, the disciples understood. The journey through Sheol, the proclamation to the spirits, the liberation of the saints, the conquest of the keys, all of it culminated here. Their master was not just a resurrected teacher. He was the conquering king, the victorious high priest, the true hero. He was the Lord of both the living and the dead. His journey had redefined reality. Death was no longer a period at the end of a sentence, but a comma. The abyss was not a destination, but a passageway. The grave was not a prison, but a doorway into glory for all who would follow him. The 3-day journey, from the final breath on the cross to the first breath in the garden, was complete. It was a journey marked by silence to the world, but deafening with activity in the spirit. It was a mission that spanned the lowest depths of hell to the highest courts of heaven. He had not just died for us, he had walked through the worst of our human experience teeth itself to ensure that nothing, absolutely nothing, in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. The story did not end in that locked room. It was just beginning. The fear of the disciples was transformed into a fire that would spread across the globe. They had seen the risen King. They had touched his scars, and they now knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the one who holds the keys to death is the one who holds the key to life. And because he lives, they and all who believe would live also. The darkness had done its worst, and the light had won. This incredible journey of victory is the foundation of our hope. If this story has touched your spirit and deepened your understanding of Christ's triumph over darkness, please show your support by giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who needs to hear this message. To continue exploring the profound truths of Scripture and the promises of our faith, make sure you subscribe to Jesus and Tomorrow. Join our community as we uncover the power and love that conquered the grave and secured our future.